There is an idea that has existed for thousands of years across cultures and traditions, that even a fool appears wise when he chooses silence. Not because silence hides the fool, but because silence in itself carries the weight of someone who has nothing left to prove. Most people have spent their entire lives doing the opposite. I think one of the things people need to learn is the need to be comfortable with silence, because you lose authority the moment you rush to fill it. The need to explain is, in most people, a disguised form of asking for approval, and whoever realizes this never reads the world the same way again. The most common belief is that the more you demonstrate knowledge, the more credibility you build. More detail, more context, more evidence that you know what you were doing. But here's what is actually happening. Every extra word you add beyond what is necessary is an involuntary signal of insecurity, and the people around you read that signal with precision, even without knowing they are reading it. Think about the most capable people you've encountered in your life, the ones who seem to carry a natural weight. Not loud, not theatrical, they said what needed to be said, and then they stopped. And something about that stillness made you take them more seriously than the person who explained everything 3 times over. Now think about a different kind of person. Someone equally intelligent, equally prepared, maybe more so. But whenever they speak, there is something in the delivery that feels slightly off. Not wrong exactly, just too much. Too eager to justify, too quick to add one more reason, one more example, one more piece of evidence that they belong in the room. But here's the strange part. The second person is often more qualified, more experienced, more technically capable than the first. And yet, somehow, they leave conversations with less authority than they arrived with. This is not about eloquence. It is not about vocabulary or confidence in the theatrical sense, or how well someone presents themselves. It is about something far more specific. It is about the relationship a person has with the space between their words. Most people have never examined that relationship. They have spent years developing skills, accumulating credentials, building knowledge, and almost no time understanding what happens in the 3 seconds after they finish a sentence. Those 3 seconds are where perception is formed, not during the answer, after it. And what people do in that space reveals more about their internal state than anything they actually said. The person who adds more after the silence has already started to reveal something. The person who sits inside the silence, unbothered, has already communicated something that words could never have delivered. What separates these two people is not intelligence. It is not preparation. It is not even personality. It is a single psychological pattern that most people never identify in themselves. And once you understand it, you will begin to see it everywhere. In boardrooms, in first meetings, in the way someone defends their decisions, in the way someone responds to a question they weren't expecting. The pattern is not what you say, it is what you feel the need to say. And that distinction changes everything. From the moment most people enter a classroom, they're taught one version of how credibility works. You raise your hand, you answer the question, you elaborate, you show your work. The student who gives the longest answer is often the one the teacher remembers, the one who expands, who connects ideas, who adds context to context. That person looks competent. That person looks like they know what they are doing. And then that student grows up, enters a professional environment, and carries the same logic with them without ever questioning it. More detail equals more trust. More explanation equals more understanding. More words equal more credibility. It makes intuitive sense. If you know something, you should be able to demonstrate that you know it. And demonstration, in the most common understanding, means speaking. It means filling the room with evidence of your thinking. It means showing the process, not just the conclusion. This is the part that most people get completely wrong. Because this logic is not wrong in all contexts. In a classroom, it often works. In a technical presentation to a team that needs information, it can be appropriate. There are situations where thoroughness is exactly what the moment requires. But most people apply this logic universally. They carry it into every high-stakes conversation, every important meeting, every interaction where they feel they need to be taken seriously. And in those environments, The logic does not just stop working, it actively works against them. The belief runs deeper than professional habits. For many people, speaking more is a way of managing anxiety, not conscious anxiety, not the kind that makes your hands shake, the quiet, background kind that whispers, "You are not enough until you prove otherwise." And so they prove, again and again, in every room, with every person who might be evaluating them. They explain their decisions before anyone questions them. They justify their choices before anyone pushes back. They add context that nobody asked for. They bridge silences that weren't asking to be filled. And every single time they do this, they believe they are building their case. What they are actually doing is the opposite. They're broadcasting a signal that sits underneath the words. A signal that says, "I'm not sure you believe me. I'm not sure I have convinced you. I'm not sure I'm enough, so I'm going to keep talking until something lands." The people receiving that signal are not always conscious of reading it, but they read it. The body reads it before the mind does. Something shifts in how they position themselves in the conversation. Something changes in the level of respect they extend. Not dramatically, not obviously, but it changes. The belief that more words build more credibility is one of the most common and most costly assumptions in human communication. And almost nobody identifies it as a belief. They experience it as common sense. Here is what is actually happening beneath the surface. When a person feels pressure, the pressure of being evaluated, of needing to be believed, of wanting to be taken seriously, their nervous system interprets that pressure as a form of threat. Not a physical threat, a social one. And the brain responds to social threat in ways that are not entirely rational. One of the most consistent responses to social pressure is the urge to speak, to fill space, to produce evidence of competence in real time as if volume alone could resolve the uncertainty. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism. It developed in environments where speaking up, justifying yourself, and demonstrating your thinking kept you safe. In school, in early professional environments, in families where you had to earn your position in the room. The problem is that the mechanism does not update when the environment changes. Most people never realize this. A person who learned that explaining themselves was the way to avoid criticism will carry that pattern into every high-stakes room they enter for the rest of their life, unless something causes them to stop and examine it directly. Because the pattern does not feel like a pattern. It feels like the obvious thing to do. It feels like competence. Think about a specific type of person. A consultant who has spent 15 years building expertise in a narrow field. She knows more about her domain than almost anyone in the room. She has data, case studies, documented results. She is by every objective measure the most qualified person at the table. But whenever a client pushes back, even gently, even with a simple clarifying question, something shifts in her. She adds more. She references another case study. She brings in another data point. She over-explains a conclusion she had already explained clearly 30 seconds before. And the client, who was genuinely just asking for clarification, starts to feel something uncomfortable. Not dissatisfaction with the answer, something more subtle, a quiet sense that this person needs them to be convinced. And people who need to be convinced of something do not inspire confidence. They invite skepticism. Pay close attention to what happens next. The client begins to ask more questions, not because they are more curious, but because something in the dynamic has shifted. The consultant's over-explanation created a permission structure, an implicit invitation to probe further, to push harder, to treat the conversation as a negotiation rather than a consultation. The consultant, sensing more pressure, explains more, and the cycle deepens. This is the hidden pattern. It does not begin with a bad answer. It begins with one extra sentence, one unnecessary justification, one detail added not because it was needed, but because the silence that followed the real answer felt dangerous. Research on conversational behavior from institutions studying social cognition has consistently found that people calibrate their level of trust and authority perception not primarily on the content of what someone says, but on the behavioral signals surrounding how they say it. The pause before an answer, the pause after it, the willingness to let an idea exist without immediately reinforcing it. This is the mechanism that most high-achieving, highly intelligent people have never been told about, because the environments that trained them rewarded exactly the opposite behavior. Consider what happened once with a property consultant at a meeting with a private family office, a significant potential relationship. This particular individual walked in with good energy, solid preparation, the kind of presence that made you think something real might happen in that room. He delivered his presentation, clear, structured, confident enough. Then came the silence. Not a hostile silence, not a dismissive one, simply the kind of pause that follows a completed thought, the moment where the other side is processing, weighing, deciding what they actually think. And he panicked. He started talking, added numbers he had already mentioned, referenced a case study, then referenced another that partially contradicted the first. By the time the silence had been filled, he had added 6 minutes of content that nobody in the room had asked for. He lost the room not in the presentation, he lost it in those 6 minutes after it ended. Because what those 6 minutes communicated was not expertise. They communicated that he could not tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing what the other side was thinking. And a person who cannot tolerate uncertainty in a quiet room is not a person you trust with a complicated situation. The most persuasive thing he could have done in that moment was nothing. Not as a tactic, not as a technique, but because the answer he had already given was complete. Everything that followed it was not information, it was anxiety looking for a place to land. And this is the hidden pattern in its clearest form. It is not about talking too much in general. It is about what happens specifically in the moments after a complete thought. What a person does in that window, whether they hold the space or rush to fill it, is one of the most revealing behavioral signals in human communication. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand why this pattern is so persistent, you need to understand what silence actually represents to the human brain in a social context. Silence in most social environments reads as unresolved. It feels like the conversation is not yet settled, like a verdict has not been delivered. And for people whose psychological baseline involves a constant low-level monitoring of how they're being perceived, unresolved feels dangerous. Psychologists refer to this underlying state as approval orientation, a pervasive attunement to how others are evaluating you in real time. Not vanity, not insecurity in the shallow sense, a deep automatic scanning of the social environment for signals of acceptance or rejection. People with strong approval orientation do not experience this as insecurity. They experience it as awareness, as social intelligence, as being attuned to the room. And in many respects, they are. They are excellent at reading subtle signals, adjusting their behavior in response to others, sensing what a room wants from them. The problem is that this orientation, when activated under pressure, produces exactly the wrong output. It produces more words, more explanation, more evidence, more effort to resolve the unresolved, when the most powerful move available would be to stay still. And this is where things become interesting. Research from behavioral scientists studying social pressure and verbal behavior has found that people who over-explain under pressure are not doing so because they lack confidence. They are doing so because they are highly socially aware, and their awareness is interpreting silence as negative feedback. The brain, in that moment, is not saying you failed. It is saying the verdict is not yet in, and you should do more to influence it. But here is what that same research shows. The more words produced in an attempt to influence the verdict, the more negatively the verdict tends to go. Because the observer, the client, the employer, the person across the table, is not evaluating the content of the additional words. They are evaluating the behavior of producing them. And the behavior reads as need. Need to be believed. Need to be approved of. Need to close the gap between how you see yourself and how you fear others might see you. This need is not weakness. Every person has some version of it. The difference between people who command authority and people who consistently undermine it is not the absence of this need. It is what they do when they feel it. There is another layer to this that is worth examining.
Many intelligent, high-functioning people develop a particular variant of this pattern that is especially difficult to detect, in themselves or in others. They do not over-explain out of obvious nervousness. They over-explain through precision, through thoroughness, through the addition of nuance, caveats, and qualifications that are, individually, entirely reasonable. Imagine someone who leads a strategic consulting firm, 12 years of building client relationships, excellent analytical mind. Every word he adds to an answer is technically accurate. Every qualification he includes is genuinely valid. But he qualifies everything. When asked if a particular approach will work, he says yes under these conditions, with these caveats, assuming the team executes at this level and provided that external variables remain within this range, which historically they tend to, although there are exceptions worth noting. Every piece of that answer is true, but the person who asked the question, a board member considering a significant decision, does not walk away more informed. They walk away less certain.
Because the answer communicated not the expertise of the speaker, but the discomfort of someone who could not allow themselves to simply say yes. The qualifications were not for the board member's benefit. They were protection, a hedge against being wrong, a way of staying safe inside the appearance of expertise without fully committing to it. Studies on decision-making and authority perception, including work from social psychologists examining how leaders are perceived under uncertainty, have found that authoritative figures are consistently judged not by how complete their answers are, but by how settled they appear inside those answers. Certainty of manner correlates with perceived competence more strongly than accuracy of content. This does not mean being dishonest. It does not mean overstating what you know. It means understanding that the signal you send through your relationship with your own words carries as much information as the words themselves. The person who says yes and then waits, who allows the weight of that yes to exist without immediately surrounding it with qualifications, communicates something that the more thorough answer does not. They communicate that they are not afraid of the answer, that they are not trying to manage your reaction to it, that the answer is the answer, and what you do with it is yours to decide. That quality, that stillness inside an answer is what people read as authority. It cannot be faked through posture or vocabulary. It is a genuine internal state, and it develops when a person stops relating to conversation as something that needs to be controlled and starts relating to it as something that simply unfolds. The shift sounds subtle. Its effects are not. When someone stops adding words to manage the perception of others, something changes in how they occupy a conversation. They become, in the truest sense, less reactive. Not passive, not disengaged, simply no longer driven by the quiet background urgency of needing the room to decide something in their favor. And the room notices. Not because the person did something, because they stopped doing something they had been doing their entire professional life, without ever realizing it. There is a particular kind of relief that comes with being in a conversation with someone who does not need anything from you, who is not quietly waiting for you to validate them, who asks a question because they want to know the answer, not because asking the question is itself a performance. That quality, that genuine absence of agenda, is rare enough that people feel it immediately, even if they cannot name it. And the deeper irony is this: the people most desperate to be seen as competent are often the ones who make it hardest for others to see them clearly, because the performance gets in the way. The constant production of evidence crowds out the actual person behind it. You stop seeing the human being and start experiencing the campaign. The people who have genuinely stopped performing are not invisible. They are in fact extraordinarily visible, precisely because there is nothing between you and what they actually are. No layer of justification, no preemptive defense, just the person and the words they chose, and then the silence they were comfortable enough to leave alone. In high-stakes social and professional environments, authority is not something that is declared. It is something that is assigned by others, often unconsciously, based on behavioral signals that have nothing to do with credentials or titles. One of the most powerful of these signals is how a person handles the space after they speak. Once you understand this, many things start to make sense. Think about how two different people respond to the same question in a board meeting. Someone asks a question that carries some edge, not hostile but pointed, the kind of question that implies something might not be working. The first person responds immediately. Their answer is comprehensive, detailed, structured. It addresses the question, anticipates a follow-up, adds context, and closes with a reference to a supporting document. It is, objectively, a thorough answer. But they never stopped moving. Their energy stayed in a register of continuous justification, as if the answer alone was not sufficient and needed to be surrounded, protected, reinforced. The second person pauses, not for effect, not as a technique, simply because they are actually thinking. When they speak, the answer is shorter, 3 sentences, maybe 4, and when they finish, they stop. They don't look around the room for confirmation, they don't add a softening phrase at the end. They simply finish, and then they are still. The room responds differently to each person, not because the second person's answer was better. Often the first person's answer contained more valuable information. But information is not the only thing being evaluated in that room. Psychological safety is being evaluated, reliability, the quiet question of whether this is someone who knows what they are doing even when they are being pressed. This is the social physics of words. More produces less. Less, delivered with stillness, produces more. It is one of the most counterintuitive patterns in human interaction, and it operates constantly in every professional and social environment, shaping how people are perceived and what level of trust and authority they are extended. Most people are not aware they are participating in this dynamic. They are simply doing what feels natural, what feels safe, what feels like they are showing up well. But feeling like you are showing up well and actually showing up well are two very different experiences, and the gap between them is measured almost entirely in the words you chose not to say. Understanding a pattern is not the same as changing it. Most people who recognize this in themselves feel a brief clarity, a moment of genuine insight, and then the next time they are in a pressure situation, the old mechanism activates before the insight has a chance to intervene. The words are out before the thought arrives. So the question is not whether you understand this intellectually. The question is what actually shifts the internal state that produces the behavior. There are 3 reorientations that matter here. Not techniques, not scripts, reorientations, ways of relating to the conversation that change what you do naturally before you have to think about it. But here's the strange part. None of these reorientations are about speaking less. That framing is misleading because it puts the focus on output, on monitoring and controlling how much you say. That kind of monitoring creates its own version of self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is the problem, not the solution. The reorientations are about something more internal, about what you are trying to do when you speak. The first reorientation is this: the answer ends with the answer. Not with the other person's reaction, not with the silence that follows, not with any visible confirmation that you have been understood or believed. Most people, without realizing it, extend their answers until they receive some signal from the other side that the answer landed. A nod, a verbal acknowledgement, some visible shift in the other person's expression. And because that signal does not always come immediately, they keep producing words until it does. The reorientation is recognizing that the answer is complete when the information is complete. This is the social physics of words. More produces less. Less, delivered with stillness, produces more. It is one of the most counterintuitive patterns in human interaction, and it operates constantly in every professional and social environment, shaping how people are perceived and what level of trust and authority they are extended. Most people are not aware they are participating in this dynamic. They are simply doing what feels natural, what feels safe, what feels like they are showing up well. But feeling like you are showing up well and actually showing up are two very different experiences, and the gap between them is measured almost entirely in the words you chose not to say. Understanding a pattern is not the same as changing it.
Most people who recognize this in themselves feel a brief clarity, a moment of genuine insight, and then the next time they are in a pressure situation, the old mechanism activates before the insight has a chance to intervene. The words are out before the thought arrives. So the question is not whether you understand this intellectually. The question is what actually shifts the internal state that produces the behavior. There are 3 reorientations that matter here. Not techniques, not scripts, reorientations, ways of relating to the conversation that change what you do naturally before you have to think about it. But here's the strange part. None of these reorientations are about speaking less. That framing is misleading because it puts the focus on output, on monitoring and controlling how much you say. That kind of monitoring creates its own version of self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is the problem, not the solution. The reorientations are about something more internal, about what you are trying to do when you speak. The first reorientation is this: the answer ends with the answer. Not with the other person's reaction, not with the silence that follows, not with any visible confirmation that you have been understood or believed. Most people, without realizing it, extend their answers until they receive some signal from the other side that the answer landed. A nod, a verbal acknowledgement, some visible shift in the other person's expression. And because that signal does not always come immediately, they keep producing words until it does. The reorientation is recognizing that the answer is complete when the information is complete.
What happens after that, in the silence, in the other person's processing, is theirs, not yours. You do not own the space after your answer. You own the answer itself. The moment you stop extending your response into that space, the silence stops feeling like a threat. It becomes simply what follows a complete thought. The second reorientation is understanding that silence belongs to whoever just finished speaking. There is a common assumption that silence is a shared burden, that whoever is in the room is collectively responsible for resolving it. This assumption is what produces the urge to fill it. Someone else's silence feels like a gap you are obligated to close. But in reality, when you have just answered a question, the silence that follows belongs to you. It is the natural extension of the space your answer created. You are not abandoning the conversation by allowing it to exist. You are completing it. Think about it this way. A waterfall does not wait. It produces constantly, continuously, filling every space below it without discrimination. A well waits. It holds what it contains. And what it contains is drawn only when it is needed. In almost every high-stakes conversation, being a well produces more authority than being a waterfall, not because what the well contains is better, but because it requires the other person to come to it. When you stop producing constantly and allow information to be drawn, you change the direction of the social dynamic, and people do not always consciously notice that change. They simply find themselves relating to you differently. The third reorientation is the most counterintuitive. The question you do not answer has more power than the one you anticipate. There's an impulse, common among smart, fast-thinking people, to stay ahead of the conversation, to see where the line of questioning is heading and to address it preemptively, to provide the next answer before the next question has been asked. This impulse feels like efficiency. It feels like being one step ahead, but what it actually does is collapse the space between you and the other person. It removes their agency. It answers questions they hadn't yet asked, and in doing so, it communicates that you are not responding to the conversation. You are trying to control it. The person who waits, who answers only what was asked and nothing beyond it, does the opposite. They preserve the space. They allow the other person to construct the next question from what they actually need to know, not from what you assumed they would ask. That discipline of answering the question that was asked and not the one you imagined might come next is what separates reactive intelligence from settled intelligence. And settled intelligence is what commands rooms. Most people, when they encounter an idea like this, immediately begin to apply it outward. They think of the person at work who over-explains constantly, the colleague who qualifies every statement, the manager who adds 5 sentences after every clear answer. They see the pattern clearly in others. They find it almost obvious once it has been named. What is harder is the inward application, because the pattern does not feel like a pattern from the inside. It feels like thoroughness. It feels like care. It feels like being a good communicator, someone who makes sure the other person has everything they need to understand. From within the behavior, it looks like competence. That is what makes it so persistent. Most people never realize this. The behavior you most need to examine is rarely the one that feels obviously wrong. It is the one that feels entirely justified, the one you would defend without hesitation if someone questioned it. Think about the conversations in your own life where you consistently say more than you need to. Not all conversations. Most people have at least some contexts where they are naturally economical, where they feel settled enough to answer and stop. But there are other contexts, specific kinds of conversations, with specific kinds of people, or in specific kinds of situations. Maybe it is when you feel like your expertise is being questioned. Maybe it is in rooms where you are newer, where you have not yet established your position. Maybe it is in conversations about money, or status, or decisions that carry visible consequences. In those conversations, something activates. The internal register shifts, and the words begin to come. Not because the situation requires more information, but because something inside you requires more safety than the situation is currently providing. What is that thing actually protecting? That is the question worth sitting with. Not the behavior itself, not the words, the need underneath them, the thing that silence threatens, the thing that another person's unreadable face after your answer seems to put at risk. Because it is rarely the professional outcome that feels most threatened in those moments. It is something more primary. A sense of being seen as capable, of being respected, of belonging in the room on the terms you believe you deserve. And the painful irony is that the very behavior designed to secure that outcome is the behavior most likely to undermine it. Not because people are cruel, not because they are evaluating you harshly, but because the signal is clear, even when it is quiet, even when no one could articulate what they are reading it nonetheless. The question is not whether you can simply decide to speak less. That kind of decision made at the level of behavior without touching the underlying state rarely holds. You hold it in the low-pressure moments, and then the pressure comes and the mechanism reasserts itself and you are back where you started. The real question is whether you can find enough internal security to let the silence exist, to trust that the answer you gave was the answer, to release the need to know what the other person decided before they tell you. That is the real discipline, and it has nothing to do with what you say. Return to the beginning for a moment. The most prepared person in the room losing authority not because they said something wrong, but because they said too much. That image at the start might have felt like an observation about communication, about professional behavior, about how to perform better in high-stakes situations. But it is actually about something deeper than that. It is about the relationship between what you know and what others need you to know you know. Those are two very different things, and most people, for most of their lives, are not entirely clear on which one is driving them when they speak. Once you understand this, many things start to make sense. The person who adds words after a complete answer is not trying to inform, they are trying to be seen. They are trying to close a gap that exists not in the conversation but inside them, the gap between how they see themselves and how others might fear they might see them. This gap is not unique to any particular kind of person. It is not a sign of fragility or failure. It is a feature of human psychology built in by environments that consistently taught that being seen as competent required visible proof of competence. But at some point, that framework stops serving. In the early stages of a career, demonstrating competence through thoroughness is often appropriate. You have not yet established a record. You have not yet been in the room long enough for people to know what you bring. And so you show. You produce. You make the invisible visible. But the people who carry that behavior forward indefinitely into rooms where they are already known, already trusted, already established, are not showing competence. They are showing that they have not yet made the internal transition from someone who is trying to prove something to someone who simply is something. That transition is quieter than it sounds. It does not happen through achievement. It does not happen through accumulating more credentials or more results or more evidence of capability. Those things do not resolve the internal gap. They only raise the stakes of protecting it. The transition happens when a person becomes genuinely unconcerned with managing the perceptions of others in real time. Not indifferent to outcomes, not careless about relationships, simply no longer running the constant background process of assessing whether they are being received correctly. That state cannot be manufactured in a conversation. It develops over time, through gradual and often uncomfortable recognition that the approval being sought is not the thing that was actually needed, that the verdict of the room, whatever it is, does not alter the underlying reality of what you know, what you have built, and what you are capable of. And when that recognition settles, not as an idea, but as an actual internal experience, the words change. Not because you decided to say less, because you simply stopped needing to say more. The authority that most people spend their lives trying to construct through language is the authority that appears naturally when they stop constructing. It cannot be acquired by speaking. It can only be revealed by stopping. Most people will go their entire lives speaking into silences they were never asked to fill, defending positions that were never actually under attack, explaining decisions to rooms that had already made up their minds. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack capability, because they never examined the single assumption underneath all of it, that what they say is the same as what others hear about who they are. It is not. What people hear underneath the words is the state that produced them, and the state that produces unnecessary words is always the same. It is looking for something. The person who has stopped looking, who has found what they needed somewhere quieter than a conversation, speaks differently. Not less often, not more briefly necessarily, just without need. And need, when it is absent, leaves a particular quality in its place. Something that everyone in the room can feel, something that no explanation could ever produce. The world does not remember what the most prepared person said in the room that day. It remembers the moment the words finally stopped. That moment, when nothing is being defended, nothing is being proven, and the silence is allowed to exist without anyone rushing to fill it, that is the moment that separates the people who are trying to arrive from the people who have already arrived. Most people spend their entire lives preparing for a version of authority that can only be performed. The quieter truth is that real authority cannot be performed at all. It can only be inhabited. And the entrance to that place is always the same. It is the word you decided not to say.